Welcome to our part 2 on textiles and textile selection and the environment. So in part 1 we talked about textile selection and looking at fabric defects. Now we're going to look at the role it has when it comes to the environment and sustainability. So what is the problem? The main problem is that we throw away a lot of textile trash. What happens is, until recent times, not a lot of clothes were necessarily just donated or recycled. A lot of it was just thrown away. A lot of people have admitted to just they don't want a garment or it has a stain or a tear and they throw it away. We create a lot of trash in terms of production. So when we grab the fibers, when we have the fibers left over after we spin it into yarn, and then when we have remnants from turning the yarn into fabric. And when we cut, we have all this fabric that we end up cutting away and throwing in the garbage. So the problem that's tied into that is that most textiles are not, or a lot of them are not biodegradable. So they don't, which means they don't have the ability to break down into the soil. So it takes a long time to biodegrade. Most textiles are not biodegradable, which means they don't have the ability to degrade or break down into the soil. So when you throw something in the trash, we look at how it can break down into the soil. If it's not, it just stays on the surface and it starts collecting. That's why you have the issue with the trash. Or it can take too long to biodegrade. So just so you can get an idea, cotton, which is biodegradable, takes on average of 5 to 6 months. And it can vary depending on the cotton plant, but it takes 5 to 6 months to biodegrade. Whereas synthetics such as polyester, nylon, acrylic can take hundreds and hundreds of years to biodegrade. Also, another problem is that the production of fashion items require a lot of energy. Think about the big factories, all the sewing machines, all the electricity to run the sewing machines. Think about all the machines to dye, all the stuff I've shown you, where the machines where it goes into dyeing and printing. And it does create a lot of pollution, whether it's in the air or in the water. Another thing we need to deal with is how we recycle garments. So just so you know, only about 15% of consumer used clothing is recycled. A lot of people admit to throwing it away in the trash. They don't recycle it, they don't upcycle it, they don't donate. We do have an issue with garments and textile products ending up in the trash. About over 15 million tons of used textile waste is generated in the U.S. This is just the U.S. Nearly 100% of all textile clothing, nearly 100% of textiles are recyclable. They're just not recycled. So you can breathe new life into these garments or accessories or furniture. Synthetic clothing is a problem because we have a lot of items that are made out of these synthetic fibers that are not biodegradable. It would take hundreds of years for it to decompose. So I gave you a link so you can take, it's a quick preview just so you can see main issue in Bangladesh, a big textile a hub, and it just has a lot of issues with water pollution. So you can see, up front, because you're going to be looking at a documentary highlighting the problem, but this is just a preview so you can start really looking at it and thinking of potential solutions. And that's a big thing I want to push for you is think about solutions. We tend to complain. As human beings, we complain. What's the problem? We complain, we whine, we complain. What's the solution, right? We know what the problem is. The problem is evident. It's clear. What can we do different? That's the question we need to ask. What can we do differently? What are possible solutions? Starting from the design process, you have to start thinking about creating green products. So things that you can reuse, things that can biodegrade, choosing elements that will be biodegradable, or designing in a way that you can reuse it. So think about conservation, making things last longer, maybe buying less items but making them last longer. I really think you need to look at LCA. LCA stands for Life Cycle Assessment. It's a cradle to grave approach. And what that means, cradle to grave, think cradle when you're born, you're put in a cradle. So that's the cradle portion, and when you die, you go into the grave. So it's from birth to death. So the idea is to look at the big picture from the very beginning. Let's say it's an upholstered bench, okay, and it's made out of cloth, It's made out of wood and cloth, so we're going to look at all the way from the raw material acquisition, getting the wood for the legs and the base, and getting the fabric and the buttons to make it tufted. So you're looking at how you get all the materials for it, all the way to, you know, how you would get rid, how you use it, all the way to how you get rid of it. So would it be something that would typically get thrown away? And if you do like cheaper materials, particle board, it'll break, it'll get thrown away. But if you make an upholstered chair or bench that has really strong foundation, made out of good wood, but it has a stain or a rip on the textile, you can reupholster it, right? And you can design it in a way that makes it easy to reupholster, and that will encourage the consumer to reupholster rather than just get rid of it. That's the idea. It's even how you look at it when you dispose of it. Those are definitely ways of looking at it, how you get rid of it. So this is a visual so you can see, and it's not just gathering the raw materials, how you make it, how you transport it. It's also, once you make it, the transportation, how you use it, and how you either can you recycle it or how you get rid of it, but also all the energy involved in each step and all the waste that's involved in each step. So you have to consider all that. That's what LCA is, considering all of the steps and everything involved in making that item happen, get used, and then get disposed of. So things to consider: resource conservation, ways of saving energy, whether it's looking at alternative forms of energy, wind, solar, nuclear, things like that, but also changing, let's say, light bulbs, maybe saying changing our production facilities so that we're not having the factory open 24 hours a day. We only have it open a certain amount of hours, and let's make this production efficient. Just finding overall ways of saving energy where the machines aren't always on, where you turn off some of the machinery and electricity in certain floors at certain times, things like that. Looking at non-hazardous materials, maybe new chemicals, ways of reducing the chemicals, so maybe choosing a different type of fiber and a different type of yarn, and maybe paying up front a little bit more for that would make the item less prone to wrinkling, and therefore you don't have to give it that anti-wrinkle chemical finish. Recycling, and it always starts right in your personal use. So are you recycling at home? You know, I know it's inconvenient, but are you doing these practices? Because that's what you're going to translate into, you know, your company and your workplace. So you have to think about these things. And worker assessment, we have to ensure human rights. That's where you get all these issues with overseas production where people aren't getting paid a fair wage. There's not good ventilation. They're breathing all those hazardous chemicals and all the lint. They're not provided face masks. There's no emergency exits. I mean, that's what happened in Bangladesh when that horrible accident and the building collapsed and so many deaths. And it's just, it's a terrible situation to witness. Really terrible situation to witness. Showing corporate responsibility, because companies like Walmart, like Gap Inc., Nike, they say, I don't know, I didn't. And then, you know, they get caught using a sweatshop or, you know, unsafe working conditions. And then they're like, okay, we'll assemble a task force and we'll look into it. And then they'll forget about it. And 4 years later, another situation. And then they'll assemble another task force. It repeats itself. It's like every 5, 6, 7 years, we have the same situation. And it's always the same companies. They always say they didn't know, and it repeats. Cost factors have to be considered. You can't just like, I'm going to make everything solar and energy efficient. Well, it costs money to do that, and you can't do that overnight. So you have to consider costs. Also, when you're inputting this, it will make your garment or your product, your furniture piece, your textile product cost more. Is your customer willing to pay more? And as a consumer, you have to ask yourself, are you willing to pay more? We all complain about, oh my gosh, these companies are so horrible. I'm going to go to Forever 21 and pay $2 for a shirt. Well, what do you think is happening there? I mean, honestly, you're paying $2 for a shirt. So, I mean, what kind of profit is that? And, you know, do you really think the person who sewed that got paid a minimum wage? I mean, they didn't. But there you are jumping into Forever 21 when it was open. So you have to think about these things. Another example is organic cotton, where for it to be listed as organic cotton, one thing you have to understand is it has to be organic, like truly organic. That means the cotton has to be produced in a farm that has been using organic practices for a minimum of 3 years. Anything over that would not be considered organic. Now, if it's being grown in organic practices, but it's under 3 years, it would be considered transitional cotton. Okay, and you can put that on the label, transitional cotton. That gives it more exclusivity than regular cotton. Otherwise, it's regular cotton. Now, both are more expensive. You get less cotton per acre. It's more expensive processing. So what does that mean? If you're like, well, I'm not going to grow cotton, why are you telling me this? Well, because if you order organic or transitional cotton or fabric made out of this, you're going to pay more per yard, which means it's going to cost you more to make a garment than if it wasn't made out of organic cotton, and therefore the price point needs to go up. Your customer has to be willing to pay for that. So again, I ask you, are you willing to pay for it? And you have to think about that as a customer. Why do they have to wait 3 years for it to be considered organic? Because it takes that long to get all the pesticides and everything out of the soil. Now, what also makes it harder is that very few chemicals qualify for treating organic cotton. So whether it's to get rid of the pesticides as you grow it, or when you want to dye it, or if you want to add appliques and decorations, there's only a handful of things you can use with organic. So this is just a visual so you can see different things that can happen to help create a better crop. And again, it starts from here, making choices like ordering the fabric that's made out of these raw materials. So these are things you have to consider. You know, colored cotton, if you're like, okay, I'm not going to dye it, I have to order colored cotton, just realize you are limited in colors. It's very earthy, but that's it. I mean, you don't have too much choices in terms of colored cotton. So fox fiber, like I've shown you in class, is a colored fiber, and it also is even more expensive than regular organic cotton. So it's going to cost you more. So that's something to think about. But then you don't have to worry about dyeing. We always focus on complaining and the problems. We have to look at solutions, right? What can we do? So these 3 links, please view these videos. One is on reusing clothing. One is on recycling bottles to make polyester. So polyesters, there's certain types of polyester being made out of recycled fibers, and this is getting much better because it's softer now. It used to be kind of, it had not a good hand, and now it does. But what we're doing with reusing our clothing, what happens to clothing when we get rid of it, when we're not using it here in the U.S., it gets shipped overseas, and that's controversial, as well as, you know, how we break down actual clothing to recycle it. And innovation. So this one on spider silk, and let me tell you, any of these 3 subjects can be for your final project on your research. But these innovation on spider silk, which is a synthetic silk, so it's showing a lot of promise. I wasn't too excited about it when I first heard about it. I thought it was kind of gimmicky, and then when I did research on it, I'm very excited. This looks like it has a lot of promise. It's really mimicking silk. It is done in a lab, which I don't like, but it is mimicking silk in such a way, and it's cheaper to produce. And what's great is that it really reduces the need of water, which I love to see. So it's definitely more sustainable, and it's a better production overall. So take a look at that. These are really exciting things that we're looking into when it comes to the future of textiles and looking at sustainability. Now, one thing that I asked you to do is what can you do on the personal level? Because it starts in the home. It starts with you. So things like buying secondhand, you know, thrift shopping. You can do it at a brick and mortar, an actual physical store once the lockdown is over. So like Goodwill, Salvation Army, local thrift shops. There's also online thrift shops like ThredUp, eBay, Poshmark, The Real Real. You can rent clothing, like Rent the Runway. That's increasing. And we're starting, it used to be like only poor people would do that, or it's embarrassing. I wouldn't be caught debt thrifting. And now it's kind of a cool thing. Young people do it. I mean, if you go to San Francisco, it's just like all these streets just filled with thrift shops. That's all you see is thrift shops. So it's like the cool thing to do now. And now even Sweden has opened the world's first secondhand mall. The entire mall is filled with stores with items that are used. Looking at vocabulary, because you see it all the time in like automobiles, right? It's not buying a used car, it's pre-owned, right? It's a pre-owned car. And so they'll try to play with the words. So instead of used clothing, it's pre-loved. You know, it was loved before. Now you get a chance to love it. There's also items that haven't been used. They have brand new with tags, but you know, the person had it, it sat in their closet, and they didn't wear it, and they're giving it away. Those are things that you can do in actual recycling. If you have a garment with a hole or a tear, do you just throw it away? Do you try to repair it? Do you, the strap broke, are you repairing it? Are you breathing second life to it? So those are things that you can do at home. And when you think that way, you're going to be able to think on a larger scale for a company. Okay, so think about that as you look at the next week in the documentary. Think about these things and as you do your research. Okay, so this concludes our lecture. Thanks for listening.